Hello, happy Tuesday. Welcome back to another episode of The Practice. This show is an unrehearsed recording of my workflow. My name's Stuart. I'm a 3D artist, illustrator, designer, and your pal, and I'm excited to have you back this week. As you can probably tell by what's going on in the recording at this point, we're going to be working on a drone this week. It's been a while since I've done any hard surface modeling on the show, and it's something I do enjoy doing even though I don't do it super frequently, and thought this would be an awesome time to try that out and create a high-tech little piece of consumer electronics here. Now you'll notice that I'm going back and forth here between some reference imagery and Cinema 4D itself. And while I am gathering a lot of sort of design cues from one particular model of drone, I'm making sure not to copy it exactly and to really draw inspiration from a handful of different models. So I'm looking for sort of reference in terms of scale and the typical types of pieces and some materiality, but I'm making sure to alter the design enough so that it is original and so that, I'm sort of drawing inspirations from a few different types of drones, right? So another thing you'll notice is that on all of these cubes, I've made sure to add a fairly decent sized bevel. And really I just add some rounding and turn the subdivisions down to 1. And that's going to help us a lot when we start getting into rendering and texturing, and you'll see that it adds a lot of interest and life to the model, and it allows the edges of these planes to really catch highlights and shadows, and adds a lot of interest and some nice sort of shading and highlights and things like that. So I would recommend doing the same if you're trying something like this. So for now, I'm just sort of taking primitives and blocking out the overall form of this thing. Getting the basics in place. And I use a lot of what they call greebles in this exercise. A greeble really is like a bit of detail that is meant to give a sense of scale and a sense of sort of completion or finality to the model. These are kind of non-working, non-functional shapes and elements added to the surface of a model to make it seem, like it's a finished piece, like it's got seams and buttons and little gadgets and wires. I mean, I think the most common use case for a greeble is the model design for a sci-fi spaceship. If you look at the Millennium Falcon, for example, the design of that ship, it doesn't have a smooth surface. It's got all these little pipes and wires and doodads and gizmos, and it allows the model to seem more realistic, frankly, without getting into the engineering of each individual component of the spaceship design. Another thing I'm utilizing a lot here that is sort of a new addition to my toolkit is this correction tag. And what's really cool is the correction tag allows you to take unexpanded primitives and to do point, edge, and polygon selections on them, and actually to modify them as if they were expanded. And you might ask, what's the difference? What's the benefit or advantage there? But that allows you to, for example, create these little support legs like I have underneath the propellers here, and then, angle them inwards. But then, I can go back and change the size of the bevel really, really easily. And it'll maintain sort of the angle that I've pulled it into. So it's a non-destructive way to alter primitives in your workflow. Highly recommended. I'm going to really try to utilize a lot more of those moving forward because it seems like an excellent addition to the toolkit. Now we're going to start getting into materials and texturing a little bit here. I went ahead and swapped out the sphere for this capsule shape, put some transparency on that, and I'm adding some sort of internal components there to act like the lens of the camera. Now, ultimately, in the final rendering, a lot of these details on the reverse and bottom of the model go unnoticed, but that's okay. It was fun putting them in position, and if I ever want to use this for another project in the future, I'll have those. See here, I'm sort of taking some design cues from other drones. There really are a lot of different types out there. I was surprised to learn that this particular, or not this particular drone, but one of the drones that I was drawing some heavy inspiration from was actually featured on Apple's website as an accessory. I guess it works seamlessly with your iPhone or whatever. But we're starting to get into renderings here, and as is atypical for me, I am going to use some reflection and some specularity on the model. I don't do that a ton, mostly because it really kills render times and not typically the type of work. I usually do really friendly, sort of flat, bright colors and stuff like that. But for something like this, where we're doing hard surface modeling with these nice bevels and details, and of course metallic components, it makes sense to add specularity and some reflection. I decided after adding a couple of lights that we really needed like a fill light. So I go ahead and add a sky object and throw a luminant gradient on top of it, and then add a compositing tag and turn off seen by camera, so that we get the benefit of the lighting from that without seeing the actual gradient of it behind. Going in and adding some contrast in the materials. It's all pretty flat at this point, but it helps a lot to have some really dark components and some lighter components going on in the model. You see here, I mess around with this for a minute. At first, I knew I wanted to add a little stripe to the propeller here. It's a really great bit of detail, and I wanted to do that with a texture at first. I couldn't figure out why. If you know why this was happening, please let me know in the comments or shoot me an email or something like that. But you'll see here that I think it was because of the symmetry object I was using. I couldn't find a mapping of that gradient stripe onto this geometry that would behave properly. You'll see on the right side things are getting angled, and if I can figure out the angle and get that working on the right side, then on the left side the band wasn't wrapping entirely around the propeller. It was eliminating or misplacing the stripe on one component of it. So what I did, I just decided to just use the geometry itself to create that stripe. So I just use a little loop cut. I got the knife tool and set it on loop and cut a little segment in the geometry there, and just went ahead and textured that by hand. So wound up working okay. Another thing I was looking at, I decided that the reflections were not super noticeable, and the sort of metallic look was a bit flat on this model. So I went into the presets. I picked out an HDRI sky image from some of the presets in the materials palette, and I added that in a layer with my skylighting material. So basically like combining this gradient with some HDRI imagery just to add a little bit of additional detail into the reflections. Now, reflections look great when there's tons of stuff to reflect, but in an isolated scene like this, a lot of times reflections go totally unnoticed, right? If there's nothing above this object except for the sky object that we have in place, the only thing that's going to be reflected on it is the flat color of that gradient. So what I decided to do then is include a bit of photographic detail into that sky map. And that, I think, adds some interest and some complexity and some photographic details into the reflections, which is a much more satisfying look, in my opinion. And now I'm going ahead and adding in a radial gradient onto this lens. I always notice that when you look closely at a lens, there's often little like pink or purple or bluish highlights in there. So adding just a couple layers of simple geometry with a couple different materials, and we get a fairly sophisticated lens look fairly quickly here. I was pleased with how that came together. A couple additional greebles here, adding some dots to the top. Added a little light to the front of it, a little LED, makes it look like it's powered on. Now, this would have been a really easy one to animate. We could have just done a very simple rotation of those blades and made a little GIF, which would have looked sweet. So if you wind up making one of these, go ahead and animate it and share it with me. I'd love to see what that looks like. You'll notice once or twice here towards the end, I wound up getting that little spinning beach ball of death. I thought I was going to have a crash on my hands, but fortunately escaped without such a calamity. And now I'm doing some renderings just from different angles, just checking out the overall geometry and the lighting and seeing which angle works best for the final rendering. And this, depending on what you're making, oftentimes it makes sense to do a few renderings of an object as your final output. But with this one, we wind up really just honing in on one. Notice it's looking a little bit bluer now. I altered the gradient in the sky object to include a little bit less yellow, which I think ultimately gave us a better look. So here's an example of how flexible and awesome those correction tags can be. Because now I'm just like duplicating the cube that made up the body of the drone and duplicated it to create a little seam here, another little greeble, which would have given us some interest. And it held the angle that I needed in the duplicated piece. And then where things didn't line up ever so slightly, I could just grab those edges and scoot them over and get like a really nice seam there. It worked out well. Now we're getting close to the final piece here. And I was having a bit of an issue with the way the boule, I had sort of cut out some little like heat ventilation slots in the top of the body here. And I was getting a bit of an odd triangulation in that face here, the facet of the geometry that shared an edge with the cut. So what I went ahead and did was just increased the intersections in the geometry there. Gosh, what's it called? The subdivisions, really. I just went ahead and did a loop cut, and I cut a triangle in the rectangular face on the sides there, and that seemed to sort it out. Sometimes I notice that when you create a boule, oftentimes you'll get some odd triangulation, and often increasing the subdivisions helps there. So I think, don't quote me on this, but to my understanding, I think the Boolean geometry is a little bit better with triangles than it is with the large cubes. And so I go ahead and increase the size of the output, add a little bit of blurriness to some of the reflections. Also went ahead and added a little bit of really, really subtle noise to some of the darker values, just to get a little bit of sort of texture. I decided that, if some parts of the model were going to be really shiny and slick, it'd be great if other parts had a little bit of like a rubberized or a grippy sort of texture to them. And I knew that I wanted this piece ultimately to live on a really bright background, and I decided to try, rendering in the brightly colored background myself, or just applying it in Photoshop after the fact. And I didn't like the reflections I was getting on the drone when I actually put it in a yellow environment. So I went ahead and just decided to do that with an alpha channel in Photoshop. So here we're getting really close to the final rendering. I think the sort of some of the bluer tones work really well here with this bright yellow backdrop. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks, gang. If you like this video, please hit like and subscribe. If you have any further questions, don't hesitate to drop one in the comments below. If you want to keep up with me and the work that I'm doing, please check me out on Instagram at DLGNCE. And until next week, this is Stuart saying goodbye. Thanks.